I'll never forget the day I walked into my stepbrother's room and saw something that shocked me. It wasn't just what he was doing. It was the look on his face. He seemed vulnerable, desperate, and lonely. I didn't know whether to step back or confront him. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. Let me backtrack a bit. When I was growing up, my family wasn't exactly conventional. My mum remarried when I was 15. Jake came along a couple of years later. He was a bit older than me, and he had this cool, aloof way of looking at people that made him seem kind of intimidating. We didn't talk much at first. We were just two strangers forced to live under the same roof. But as time went on, we started sharing little things like late-night snacks in the kitchen and random TV marathons. We also had some deep conversations that made you feel like you truly understood someone. We weren't close, but we weren't distant either. We existed in this weird in-between space, like two planets orbiting the same sun but never quite colliding. But all of that changed one summer. It was a Friday afternoon, and I remember because it was blazing hot outside. The kind of heat that makes you feel sticky and restless no matter where you are. I'd just gotten home from work, tired and ready to collapse into my bed as I walked down the hallway. I noticed Jake's door was slightly ajar. Normally he kept it shut tight, so that alone was unusual. Curiosity got the better of me. I peeked in, and there he was, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands. His shoulders were tense and his breathing was shallow. At first I thought something bad had happened. Maybe a fight with his girlfriend or some kind of family drama. But then I saw it. I won't go into detail because I'm still trying to process it. Just say, I wasn't expecting it. Jake isn't the type to show his emotions, let alone in such a raw and unguarded way. My first instinct was to leave, but something held me there. Maybe it was the way his hands were trembling or the fact that he looked so incredibly human in that moment. I whispered, Jake, my voice barely audible. His head snapped up, and for a split second our eyes met. There was panic in his gaze, followed by something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I was at a loss for words, but the silence between us said it all. Before I could think of what to do next, Jake stood up and closed the door behind him, leaving me standing in the hallway with a million questions swirling in my mind. What was he doing? Why did he look so broken? I told myself it wasn't my business, but deep down I knew I couldn't just leave it alone. I couldn't shake the image of Jake from my mind. The way he looked at me, the raw emotion in his eyes. I couldn't just forget about it for the rest of the evening. I kept replaying that moment over and over in my mind. I tried to act normal at dinner, but it was impossible. I avoided looking at Jake. He didn't seem fazed, though he acted like nothing had happened. He was cracking jokes with Mom and casually scrolling through his phone like always. I knew better later that night when everyone else was asleep. I lay awake in my bed staring at the ceiling. I knew I had to. I just couldn't let this go. If Jake was going through something, I had to know what it was. He wasn't just my stepbrother. He was part of my life now, whether I liked it or not. So I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I got up, tiptoed down the hallway, and stopped outside his door. My heart was racing as I knocked softly. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then I heard his voice, low and hesitant. "It's me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I whispered, "Can I come in?" I almost turned around and left, but then the door creaked open and there he was, standing in the dim light of his room. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held that same vulnerability I'd seen earlier. He asked, "What's up?" He was leaning against the door frame like he hadn't just locked himself away for hours. I hesitated. How was I supposed to bring this up? I just wanted to check on him. I raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I'd looked at you earlier and you seemed upset for a moment." Jake didn't say anything. He just stared at me as if he was trying to figure out if I was being genuine. Then he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. His room was messy as usual. There were clothes on the floor, an empty pizza box on his desk, and his guitar propped up against the wall. I sat on the edge of his bed while he leaned back in his chair. He ran a hand through his hair and asked, "What's this about?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were cautious. I took a deep breath. "I just feel like something's been bothering you and I want to help." Jake laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. It was bitter and almost hollow. You can't help me, he said, looking away. Why not? I pressed. Because it's complicated, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe I was pushing too hard, but I couldn't help myself. Jake, you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you. For a moment he didn't respond. Then he looked at me, his expression softening. You're too good for this, he said quietly. Too good for what I asked. My heart pounding, Jake didn't answer. Instead he stood up and started pacing the room like he was wrestling with something inside. You wouldn't understand, he muttered. Try me. I stood up to face him. He stopped. He stopped and looked at me. His jaw was clenched. You really want to know? I nodded, even though part of me wasn't sure if I was ready for the answer. Jake took a deep breath. His eyes were locked on mine. Fine, he said, but don't say I didn't warn you. Jake sat back down. His shoulders slumped, and he ran his hands through his hair again. Till he was struggling to find the right words. Honestly, it was making me more nervous than I'd like. Jake finally spoke up. He exhaled deeply and said, You remember when your parents got married, right? I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. Well, back then, I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. I mean, I wasn't mad at her, but it felt like my whole life was getting flipped upside down. There was a new house, new rules, and a new family. I didn't know how to deal with it. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. Then there was you. He paused, his voice softening. You. We were just this bright, bubbly person who acted like everything was fine even when it clearly wasn't. You didn't care that we were strangers. You were just you. I felt a lump form in my throat. Jake, I didn't realize you felt that way. He shrugged and gave a faint smile, tugging at his lips. I didn't either, not at first, but over time I started noticing things about you. Little things like the way you always hum when you're cooking or how you laugh. When you're nervous, my stomach tightens, Jake. I know, he interrupted. Holding up a hand, I said, I know it's wrong. That's why I've been trying so hard to push it down and ignore it, but sometimes it just slips out. I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning and I could feel my face heating up. This wasn't what I'd expected when I came into his room. Jake continued, his tone more serious. Jake, I want you to know where I'm coming from. I don't want to mess things up for us or for our parents. This is a lot to take in. I know I shouldn't have said anything, but I needed you to know where I'm at. I'm sorry. It felt like an eternity. I could feel the tension in the room, like a physical weight pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to get up and leave, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But another part of me, the part one wasn't ready to acknowledge, wanted to stay. Finally I spoke. Jake, I don't know what to say. This is complicated. He let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, no kidding. But I think we need to figure out what this means for both of us. His expression was unreadable. I mean, we can't just ignore this. It's not fair to either of us or to our family. Jake nodded slowly as if he was processing my words. You're right, he said finally. I was a bit lost for words. Okay, he said softly, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping onto dangerous ground. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't escape the feeling of what had happened between Jake and me, even though we tried to act normal. It felt like an invisible thread was tying us together, something neither of us could ignore. Jake became distant, like he was pulling away again, but I noticed the little things, the way his gaze lingered on me for a second too long. He'd sigh when I laughed too loudly in the other room. It was like we were both tiptoeing around something bigger than us, something neither of us could quite grasp. One evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner for myself because Mom and Jake were out. I didn't think much of it. I was used to being alone in the house, even though it was a little unsettling sometimes. As I was chopping vegetables, I heard the front door creak open. I called out hello, but there was no response. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked down the hallway, wondering if my mom had come home early. When I reached the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Jake was standing there looking like he was waiting for something or someone. His face was unreadable and his posture was tense. But the moment he saw me, he froze. I felt a knot in my stomach. I asked, "What's going on?" He didn't answer right away, he just stood there staring at me. For the first time in days, I saw that vulnerability in his eyes again. "Jake," I said again, this time softer. He took a step forward, but before he could say anything, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at it quickly, but it was just a notification from work. I shoved it back into my pocket and my attention returned to Jake. "I'm sorry," he finally said. His voice was thick with something I couldn't place. "I need to talk to you." I swallowed hard, trying to figure out what Jake was going to say. He took another step, closing the gap between us. There was something in his expression that made my heart race. It was like he was fighting an internal battle, and whatever decision he was about to make was going to change everything. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just say it," I urged, my nerves getting the best of me. Jake exhaled shakily. "What happened between us the other night? I know we said we'd figure it out, but every time I try to push it away, it comes back stronger." I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't what I expected. I thought maybe we'd just go back to how things were, act like that moment never happened. But Jake was breaking the silence between us in a way that made it feel even heavier. "Hey, please," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." But he didn't listen. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop listening." He kept stepping closer. "I don't want to hurt you, but I don't want to pretend like it didn't happen either. I need you to know that it's not just about whatever this is. It's about us and what we could be." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what to say or how to respond. Part of me wanted to push him away and tell him to snap out of it, but another part of me, a part one wasn't ready to confront, felt the same pull he did for a moment. We stood there in silence, the air thick with tension. Then Jake took another step forward, and before I could react, he cupped my face in his hands. I could feel the heat of his palms against my skin, and my breath caught in my throat. But just as his lips were about to touch mine, I froze. Something in my gut told me to stop. I didn't know what. I knew we were doing the wrong thing, but I didn't know how to handle it. I pulled back quickly, my heart racing. "Jake, no," I whispered, shaking my head. Jake froze, his hands still hovering in the air like he didn't know what to do. The look on his face was a mix of shock and disbelief, but it was also laced with relief. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair as if he was trying to shake off the tension that had built up between us. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have pushed you. I just don't know what's wrong with me. You're not the only one." "I'm sorry too," I said, my voice softening. Jake's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of understanding pass between us. We were both scared. Scared of what this moment could mean, and scared of what would happen if we let it go any further. "I need some time to think." Jake nodded silently, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Yeah, okay," I said, turning and walking away. My heart was still racing and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. The worst part was that I didn't know if I had made the right choice. The next few days were unbearable. It felt like the world was pressing in on me from all sides, and like everything was out of my control. I tried to focus on work, on anything other than what had happened with Jake, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his hands on my skin, his words echoing in my head. I knew what I had to do, but I couldn't let this hang over us forever. The longer I avoided him, the more he seemed to be at the forefront of my mind. So, after a long, sleepless night, I decided it was time to face the inevitable. I kept seeing his face, his hands on my skin, his words echoing in my head. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this hang over us forever, but every time I thought about confronting Jake again, the fear of what might happen held me back. What if we couldn't go back? What if it ruined everything? But the longer I avoided him, the more I felt like I had to face the music. So after a long sleepless night, I decided it was time to face the music. It was late. It was the afternoon when I finally walked to his room. The house was unusually quiet, and I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen as I approached his door. My heart was racing in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was walking in to fix things or to make them worse. I knocked softly, waiting for a response. When there was none, I knocked again, this time a little louder. I called out, "Jake." I waited quietly, but there was a long pause. Then the door creaked open, revealing Jake standing on the other side. The other side, he looked tired and worn down, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Hey," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Hey," I replied, shifting on my feet. My stomach was doing flips, but I knew I had to get this over with. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice wavering just a little. Jake nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. "Yeah, we do," he said. I walked into his room, glancing around at the mess as usual. It was like a snapshot of his mind, cluttered and disorganized, but somehow familiar. I sat on the edge of his bed and he leaned against his desk, watching me closely. So I began, unsure of where to start. Jake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I appreciated his honesty, but it also made everything feel more real. He suddenly said, "I don't want to lose you." His voice was rougher than usual. He didn't want to be just a stepbrother or whatever we were. I looked down at my hands, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him we could never go back to how things were before. I wanted to say there was no going around what had happened between us. But the other part of me wanted to give in and see where this thing between us could go. One part of me didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to give in and see where this thing between us could go. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my voice quieter. "But I don't know how we can go back after everything that's happened." Jake's gaze softened, but there was still that uncertainty hanging between us. He walked over to the bed and sat down next to me. His body language was more open now, less guarded. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been thinking about it too, and I don't have an answer. All I know is that we can't keep pretending like this isn't real. Like what we felt didn't happen." I could feel the weight of his words settle over me. It was like he was pulling me into something deeper. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but I couldn't deny it either. Something between us had shifted. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. "I just need time." I said the words, feeling heavy in my mouth. Jake nodded, looking down at the floor for a moment. "I get it. I'll give you all the time you need, but I need you to know something." I turned to face him. My heart was beating harder now. "What?" "I won't stop," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I can't, not until we figure this out. Not until I know if we can make it work." His words hung in the air. The air was heavy with a silent promise, or maybe a warning. I wasn't sure which, but I knew one thing for sure. Everything was about to change as I stood up to leave. I felt a strange sense of finality, like we were on the edge of something we couldn't take back. Jake's gaze followed me to the door, and I could feel the weight of his eyes on my back. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I just need some time." "Yeah," Jake replied. I walked out of his room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of crossing a line that we could never uncross. The next few days felt like an eternity, no matter how hard I tried to distract myself. I couldn't shake the weight of what was happening. I kept replaying Jake's words in my head. "I won." "Stop it," kept going through my mind, making it harder to focus on anything else. Every time I walked through the house, I'd catch glimpses of him, and it was like I could feel the tension between us getting tighter with every passing moment. But I couldn't avoid it forever. I knew that eventually I had to make a decision. It was late on a Friday night when I found myself standing in front of Jake's door once again. This time I didn't knock. I opened the door and saw Jake sitting at his desk, facing away from me and looking like he was focused on something I couldn't see. He didn't hear me at first, so I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, unsure of what to do next. Finally, I cleared my throat and Jake turned in his chair, his eyes locking onto mine. He looked tired, but there was something in his expression that had shifted. It wasn't the tension or uncertainty from before. It was something else. "I need to talk," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't say anything, but he nodded and gestured for me to come in. I sat on the edge of his bed, and the silence between us was thick with anticipation. Neither of us spoke for what felt like forever. Finally, I took a deep breath and tried to find the words to make sense of everything I've been thinking. I started with us and what happened, and I realized something. Jake didn't move, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. "To avoid dealing with this," I said, my voice gaining confidence as I went on, "I can't keep pretending like what happened didn't matter. It did. I need you to know that." Jake's eyes softened, but he didn't say anything. I could feel his gaze on me like he was waiting for me to go on. I've spent the last few days trying to push this away. I admitted because it scared me. I was scared of how it would change things between us. I was also scared of what people would think if they found out. But the truth is I don't know how to ignore what's right in front of me. Jake stood up slowly, walking towards me. I could feel the tension building between us. There was a quiet pull that had been there all along, but neither of us had been ready to acknowledge it. I'm not asking for anything right now. I just need to be honest. I can't keep pretending I don't feel something with you. I feel something more. He was standing in front of me now, so close I could feel the heat of his body against mine. His hands were hovering at his sides as if he was unsure whether to reach out or not. I don't want to ruin this, I whispered, looking up at him. But I also can't keep pretending like we don't feel this connection. It's too strong to ignore. Jake's expression softened even more, and I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes for the first time. He slowly reached out and brushed his fingers against mine. The simple touch sent a shock through me, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. I don't want to ruin it either, he said quietly. His voice was barely audible, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. I don't know what this means for us, but I want to find out together. His words hung in the air for a moment, and I thought maybe we could make this work. We could figure it out, take it slow, and not let whatever this was tear us apart. But then I remembered the consequences of the risk, and I couldn't ignore it. I don't know if we should do this, I said, my voice trembling. Not yet, not. Until we really understand what this means, Jake nodded, though there was disappointment in his eyes. He stepped back slowly, giving me space, but the tension was still there between us, unspoken but undeniable. He said, I get it. We'll take it slow, but we can't ignore this. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. We didn't have all the answers, but we both knew that this moment was a turning point. I don't know what the future holds for us, I said, standing up. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. I smiled, though it was bittersweet. Yeah, we will. That night, as I left his room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just made the biggest decision of our lives. While we were taking it slow, part of me couldn't help but wonder if we were already too far gone. Only time would tell.